So welcome to our inaugural event of Borders and Migrations Week. It's our third semester doing this, and it has grown over each semester. I'd particularly like to thank all the Department of Modern Languages, the Department of International Relations, Sociology, the Andrew Bauhaus Library, the Office of the Vice President for Academic Affairs, Latin American Studies, the Office of Mission and Identity, Sigma Delta P, which is the Spanish Honor Society, Institute for Global Engagement, and the Institute for the Study of Human-Animal Relations, and Campus Ministry for helping put this all together. In the back of the room are more flyers that tell you all of the events for the week, of which there are plenty. They're all free, open to the public, and usually there's food. And if you are of the generation that uses QR codes, there's QR codes on there that take you to the website that has resources, including the posters. The resources include a toolkit, which I encourage you to look at. It lists all sorts of things related to the border, including community partners and other resources. And also there's a donation page QR in case you want to help us financially support this initiative. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you our speaker for today, Joanna Williams. I met Joanna, I think it was 3 years ago now, at the Keno Border Initiative. And I'm really glad that we could bring her to Canisius with lovely weather to give her the illusion that we always have this kind of weather. In fact, she was so impressed with the weather, she went out running this morning, which I'm a crazy person, but Joanna is the Director of Education and Advocacy for the Keno Border Initiative and does a lot of this kind of work. And we're delighted to have her here, and I think I'm going to let her and her talk speak for itself. So join me in welcoming Joanna Williams.
Thanks so much for welcoming me here to Buffalo, and just for your interest in hearing a little bit about Migration 101 today, which is what we boldly named this talk. My number one goal for you walking out of the room today would be for you to be equipped to become savvy consumers of what you hear about migration in general. So it might be what you're hearing from friends or family, it might be what you're reading on the news, but to know what are the questions I need to ask, what's the structure that I need to understand to be able to place this news or this story from a friend into the larger structure of migration. So that's the goal for today. You can tell me at the end whether or not I accomplished it. But that's the idea of this presentation. My more uplifting storytelling presentation is tomorrow night. So if you're feeling some despair after this presentation, then you should come and listen about hope tomorrow night. But to start with, we've called this Borders and Migration Week. This is called a Migration 101 presentation. Raise your hand if you would identify as a migrant. Do you think, I think that I'm a migrant? Raise your hand if you don't. So we have one person who's not quite sure. Would you like to weigh in on why you're not quite sure?
I'm from Pittsburgh. Does that count?
It's an interesting question. How many of you don't identify as a migrant? Raise your hand. Should be the rest of you, unless people have multiple identities. Maybe Richard can choose a couple of people. Why do you say that you don't identify as a migrant? Three volunteers.
Hi, I would say maybe, I would think migrants, have to cross borders, I guess, to, and then you would say Pittsburgh, you would cross over to PA, New York State one, but I would think, I guess country borders would, make someone a migrant, and since we're not doing that, I guess I wouldn't consider myself one.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else want to weigh in on why don't you think you're a migrant?
I've lived basically in Buffalo my entire life. I had grown up in the same house my whole life, so I haven't really moved anywhere. Mm-hmm. The farthest I really travel is either family vacations or for college itself, so that's really it.
So even if we define migration more broadly of
just like any moving at all, I really haven't moved in my life.
Interesting. Yeah. I was learning about Buffalo that something unique about here is that people like to stay in Buffalo, correct? You're born here, go to school here and then you live here. Just it can be a beautiful thing about the city. Migration can mean a lot of different things. So I would argue actually that you are a migrant coming here from Pittsburgh. Migration sometimes is interpreted as crossing international boundaries. I think a more helpful term to use sometimes is movement. We're people who are in movement. Whether or not we moved, maybe our parents moved, movement has a little bit less of a political charge and a sociological charge than this idea of migration. But movement in general is pretty normal for human existence. We have had our folks, the United States actually was originally settled thousands of years ago by people who had moved over, who originated in the Middle Eastern and African area. And slowly those indigenous groups moved to eventually be settled in the United States. So the whole history of human existence is one of movement. And oftentimes when we talk about migration, we don't capture the entirety of that movement. So this is the most typical, my clicker work? Oh, there we go. This is the most typical way in which we look at movement. So when we talk about migration, this is between Morocco and Spain, by the way, just for those not familiar with the geography. When we talk about movement, we're oftentimes talking about immigrants, so people who are leaving a country who are pushed out by some factor. Maybe violence, maybe poverty, and then they become immigrants. Immigrants is a term that refers to someone when they arrive to a country of destination, and they're pulled there, maybe by a job opportunity or maybe by family connections. And in that process, they're uprooted, so they're like a plant that's pulled out of the ground, and then they're rerouted once they make it to their destination country, in this or place or city, in this case, Spain from Morocco. So it's this idea of push, pull, uproot, reroute, that's typically our understanding of the journey of migration. What do you think are some assumptions that underlie this particular depiction of migration? What do we have to assume to believe that this is true, or that this truly depicts migration?
What's the question?
What is the assumptions that underlie this graphic or this chart?
Well, nobody leaves their home unless they feel they have to.
That's a big assumption here. Nobody leaves their home unless they feel they need to. What else are we assuming?
And then everybody that's pulled to a particular place will be welcomed.
The people are pulled and they're welcomed.
Then when they get there, they stay instead of moving on.
Yeah, this is a very unidirectional, singular movement. So it's Morocco to Spain. Does anyone know about a different direction of movement that might happen there?
Tourists.
We might have Spanish people who are coming to Morocco. We might have retirees who might have Spanish. So there's a number of assumptions. This idea that migration always has to be forced. The idea that migration is unidirectional and stays. And actually the other assumption underlying this is that staying in place is normal. That the most natural, normal thing to do is to stay in place. And that movement isn't normal. Because you're a plant that's rooted in the ground and you're going to be pulled up when you move. Which for some of us in this room, maybe that is true for our lives. Maybe stasis is the normal part of existence. Human history doesn't show that stasis is normal. We need to start to question this whole idea of how we talk about migration. And I would say this is how 95 to 99% of society approaches migration. Push, pull, uproot, reroute, unidirectional movement. When we talk to migration scholars, though, and as we think and understand more about migration, we actually talk about it in the terms of mobilities. As you can see here, the movement is multi-directional. It can be within countries, it can be between countries, it can be from somewhere else to there. But more importantly, mobilities doesn't just talk about people moving. So mobilities also looks at what about the way that ideas move? What about the way that money moves or goods move? All of that is part of the larger reality of movement in our world that affects then the migration of people. So mobilities theory still asks, why do people move? It still cares about, is there violence in their community? Is there economic need? And is that part of what's motivating movement? But it also asks, well, why do people stay? It doesn't take staying as the normal or as the most expected result. And it asks, when people are staying, what else is moving? So So when somebody's born in the same house that they continue to live in with their parents and with their family, and maybe do your parents live in the same house?
Yeah.
And your parents live in the same house. So that, in a sense, is stasis. There's lots that's moved around that house, and it moves in and out of that house, even if the people are still there. So that's part of the theory of mobilities that I would argue is a better theoretical lens to see migration, because it helps us understand the whole network better than if we're just looking at unidirectional movement. So let's take an example of that. So we have immigration from Guerrero. Guerrero is a state in southern Mexico, #1 place of origin for the people that we receive at the border in Nogales, Mexico. We've had over 1,000 people, so I think 2,000 people from Guerrero this year who have arrived to the border in Nogales, Mexico. So in a very basic sense, you can say that people are fleeing from Guerrero because of increases in violence, because of poverty, because the indigenous communities in Guerrero have been marginalized historically in Mexico. And they're coming to the United States because the US economy is strong and they want to get a job in the US. That would be the push-pull theory of movement. What else might we be missing on this map? When we think about migration, or if we thought about it from the mobilities perspective, what else should be there?
Well, you said it's a southern state, right?
Mhm.
So they have to go through the other states in Mexico first.
Yeah, absolutely. What about the migration from Guerrero to Puebla, or from Guerrero to the state of Mexico? Whether they're going through it or they're displacing there and then later on coming to the border? And that is really common for folks' experience. What else is moving between Mexico and the United States that's not depicted there? Maybe we hear about it in the news. Maybe we heard about it a lot in the news this week. The news I follow.
Political trends?
There's political trends, ideas. We have several different things. So we've got the movement, as you mentioned, we have movement of people internally from one state to the next. We have people coming down from Michoacan to Guerrero, people moving from Guerrero to other states. We also, in recent years, have seen a big increase in the exportation of black tar heroin from Guerrero to the US. As many of you have heard, in the United States, we have a heroin or opioid crisis, and that drug is now being manufactured in Mexico in these rural areas that have been historically marginalized. So that's part of why there's an increase in violence. We also have the importation of guns from the United States to Guerrero. The vast majority of guns used in Mexico were originally purchased in the US. We have remittances. We have folks from Guerrero that have family members in the United States that have lived here 10, 15, 20 years and are sending money back to support them, but also can support their migration. And then on the political front, this whole idea of the war on drugs is actually also an import from the US. It was in the US and throughout the 80s and 90s, became an import to Mexico in 2007. And that's affected the way the government has approached the realities of violence and the dimensions of the drug trade in Mexico. So all of those pieces moving are part of the movement of human beings. So when you're reading an article or understanding about migration, trying to see why are people coming up from El Salvador, the question can't just be why are people coming from El Salvador, but what else is moving between the US and El Salvador or in different directions that affects the movement then of folks who are arriving to the US. So that's big picture, overview of immigration. When we talk about migration and how it intersects the law, you'll hear a few different words that are used. So oftentimes the news and the public will use the term illegal, an illegal immigrant. This is when somebody who doesn't have legal authorization to be in the US. When it comes to the law or somebody who's broken the law, immigration is the only area in which breaking the law then automatically makes you become illegal for the rest of your existence in that other country. So for example, when I run a stop sign, I don't become an illegal for having run that stop sign. So that's one of the reasons that we try to avoid using that particular phrase, because it speaks to somebody's humanity and identity, or can be dehumanizing, rather than speaking to just the reality of their legal status or whether they have authorization to be in the country. Another term that we use is undocumented, which can mean that they don't have legal documents in the US. This is probably the preferred term for groups that are pro-immigrant, also has become more widely accepted in general in society, also has problems. Because I've talked to folks who live in the US who don't have legal authorization, and they'll say, well, I do have a lot of documents. I do have my Mexican passport, I do have my driver's license in New York State. You have a driver's license, right? Well, that's in limbo at the moment.
Yes.
It's yes, and hopefully will stay. So I do have a lot of documents, I just don't happen to have the visa that I would need to be legally authorized to be in the US. Another term that we use is unauthorized. That speaks more to whether or not somebody has legal permission to be in the country. But it also sounds very bureaucratic and academic. There isn't a perfect word in this mix. There's better and worse. I think academia tends to use unauthorized more. To me, it's more accurate because it's more accurately describing somebody's situation than, as I mentioned, undocumented, and certainly more than illegal. What's important is that we are conscious of the effect of the language and understand what are we implying by that word. What are we implying when we say that somebody's illegal? We're making a statement on their humanity, not just on their immigration status. We're saying that somebody's undocumented, we're making a statement on whether they have connections in the community or whether they have an existence outside of their immigration status as well. So we need to be more conscious about our use of words when it comes to migration. And it's important when we understand migration in the law that to narrow in on what are actually the crimes that come to when it comes to immigration. So this is a picture of our beautiful Nogales, Sonora. Maybe you can't see it, but we have the wall running through here. So Nogales, Arizona and Nogales, Sonora, we're one town that's now divided by a border wall. One of the few places along the border that that's actually true, that it's a single city that's in both of the countries. Somebody who's standing in the United States, so let's say that this is the US side of the border, just for context. Say someone's standing in the US without legal authorization to be in the US. That very existence in the US without legal authorization is not a crime. The federal government tried to make it a crime about a decade ago. That was one legislative proposal. But as it stands right now, just being in the US without legal authorization isn't a crime. What it means is that you don't have legal authorization to be here. If somebody's detained and they don't have that legal authorization, then they're put into what are called administrative removal proceedings. So it's not a matter for a criminal court, it's a matter for an administrative judge to decide, can this person stay in the country or do they need to go back to their country of origin or another country? So they're put in immigration detention in many cases, and they're in an administrative proceeding with the immigration court. Contrast that with somebody who's crossing the border. So somebody who was in another country and enters into the United States without being inspected. That in the United States is considered a crime. That's considered a misdemeanor, illegal entry. If that person is sent back and then crosses again, it's considered a felony, which is illegal re-entry. Does anyone know where this has come up recently in public awareness? You heard about decriminalizing immigration or the crime of crossing the border? Where did you hear it?
I was working with a group of refugees in Rochester, so we used to talk about it all the time.
Oh, interesting, yeah. Anybody else heard of this before? So we became very famous this summer because it came up in a Democratic candidate debate. I have to say that many of the candidates didn't actually understand what it meant, but it was a topic in one of the candidate debates. The United States is really unique in considering this a crime. Most of the countries throughout the world don't think that illegal entry is a crime. They don't classify it in that way, they classify it still under administrative law. We're one of the few countries that continues to consider it a crime. And we prosecute and jail people for the crime of illegal entry and illegal re-entry. So over 50% of the federal crimes that are prosecuted are illegal entry and re-entry crimes. The vast majority of prosecutorial resources we're using are to put people in jail for the act of crossing the border. So, as I mentioned, you could either be in the United States without authorization and then subject to some administrative proceeding, or cross the border and then be federally prosecuted and go into federal prison. So, oftentimes people in that situation are put in the facility. This is a picture of a real facility in Florence, Arizona. Raise your hand if you think this is immigration detention. So this is administrative immigration detention. any strong opinions? Raise your hand if you think that's the case. Raise your hand if you think it's a federal prison. This is where people are being held for the crime of illegal reentry. We have 5 or 6, 7, 8, 9. The majority of the rest are undecided. Anybody want to change your opinion? So it's actually both. To make it all the more confusing, even though these are 2 entirely separate legal systems, oftentimes people are housed in the exact same facility. So in the same building, they have people who are waiting for immigration court hearings who haven't been charged with any crime, and they have people who have been charged with illegal entry or reentry and are serving their time. And maybe even after that would be transferred to then wait for their immigration court hearing within the same facility. So it's really difficult for me to explain this to people in Nogales, Mexico. It's difficult for us to understand here. All the more difficult for me to explain in Nogales, Mexico, where I say to an asylum seeker, if you turn yourselves into US authorities at the port of entry, you're gonna go into a detention center, which is gonna look like a jail, it's gonna feel like a jail, and it's not a jail, technically, for your case. Because it doesn't, visually, or the way that somebody experiences the space is very much as a prison or as a jail, even though it's not supposed to be punitive. So it's one of the ways in which our immigration reality has overlapped with our criminal reality, and why there's so much common cause between immigration advocates and criminal justice reform, because there's so many overlaps between the 2 systems. And we'll get back to this a little bit later on. So big scale movement, small scale, how do we talk about people and what does it mean to cross the border? One of the biggest issues in immigration that we're talking about right now is the reality of refugees. So I'm actually going to give you a couple of scenarios. Maybe if you can split into groups of 5, I'm going to give each of you a scenario and have you just discuss for about 4 or 5 minutes, do I think that this person qualifies as a refugee? What we want to get at is understanding what is the definition of a refugee. So split into your groups, find your friends or your enemies, and I'll give you a scenario. We're having more heated debates than others. Let's go around and hear from each of your groups about what was the blurb on your scenario. You don't have to read it, but tell us about the person. And what did you decide, or what was the disagreement within the group? You all want to say?
Yeah.
I guess.
I'm sure that there's gonna be some trick to it.
So we had a scenario where a woman suffered domestic violence from her husband, and she tried to separate from him, but he kept forcing her to return and using her children as leverage. So we said in like legal sense, we don't really think she's a refugee, but we see how there are ways she could be considered, but overall we said no.
Do you have any reason for saying no?
Because she wasn't going to a different country, and that's kind of what we thought about refugee. She wasn't seeking asylum anywhere specific. It just said she was leaving, so we didn't really define that as a refugee.
If she lived somewhere else, would you think she met the definition of refugee?
I think so, because she was leaving the domestic violence. So yeah, I would consider that.
Great, good work, group.
All right, so ours was a student at this university in Nicaragua, and he had been participating in several protests against government, and he was, there was evidence, he was on television interviews about protesting and stuff like this, and he was afraid that the government was going to come after him and attack and kill him, as they had with other people who had been outspoken against the government. And we did consider him a refugee in that he was actually fearful of the actions his government were possibly going to take against him. And if he were to move to a different country and seeking asylum, then he would, in our opinion, be considered a refugee.
So you're dealing with this group said if he has to be in another country, but you think because of the fear that he has, he could qualify?
Yes.
We had a woman named Sylvia and her children who were living in a neighborhood that was largely affected by organized crime and organized groups like that. And a lot of their neighbors had been killed, and it felt like a war zone to them. And we thought that she's not technically considered a refugee we brought up Libya and Syria and those refugees. The government is actually, like, they've declared war, there's a war going on. And in the little blurb, it said that it felt like a war zone, but since there's no like government action of war, we feel like it's more like an asylum seeker and not a refugee.
Do you think that she would qualify for asylum? Or you're kind of discussing?
Maybe not asylum, but closer to that than a refugee.
But for you, the big thing is not government, but
Yeah.
lack of government action.
So in this case, a situation of a transgender woman born in Honduras coming to the United States to escape potentially violence from family members as well as from local gangs. I guess the questions that could determine this is whether fear of violence from family members could qualify for refugee status. If failing that, fear of violence from non-family gangs that might come under a heading like civil unrest or something to that effect. And if that specifically is or does not have to be linked to gender identity. I'm suspicious that this individual might qualify due to gang violence, but probably, I'm not knowing, but I'm suspicious that in the United States, probably the other two conditions would not be sufficient.
So you posed those questions and answered it, that maybe the gang violence might qualify if it's linked to gender identity?
That's my speculation.
That's speculation. Well, we're in speculation stage, so it's good to have a speculation. All right, we've got our final group.
Our situation involved a Salvadoran woman who owns a business and is being targeted by gangs to pay money with threats and she doesn't pay that. And so is looking to migrate. And so we had a discussion as a group talking about violence and fear and different qualifications of migrating or being a refugee. And so our conversation was a little bit unresolved, but I think we were leaning towards saying she would not qualify for refugee status because she's not fleeing a certain threat related to gender, race, or political affiliation. She just says that there's violence that she's afraid of, so she's not being targeted for a specific reason. So because of that, we don't believe she would qualify as a refugee.
This group has the advantage of having some training. Yeah, so the purpose of this wasn't to say, oh, you know, how little you know about refugees. It's actually that it's complicated, and for all but one of these cases, U.S. law isn't very clear-cut on whether these folks would qualify or would not. So when we talk about, and I'm going to talk in the next slide about the difference between refugees and asylum seekers, but both have to qualify under the same definition, the same definitional text, and then it just depends on their posture, how they entered the country, and which country they entered. This is the actual definition of somebody who would be granted refugee status, so somebody who would qualify for asylum. Somebody who's unable or unwilling to return due to a well-founded fear of persecution based on race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. So some of the cases were a little bit more clear-cut. So the case of the Nicaraguan, political opinion, and a government actor. I think it was your group, which was a group that said the lack of government was an issue. So here, it doesn't actually speak to whether it's a government actor or not. In other parts of the refugee case law and asylum law that's developed, the question is it either has to be the government that's the actor, the government is the persecutor, or the government is unable or unwilling to protect that individual. So the government doesn't have to actually be the source of persecution or of violence. They just have to be unable or unwilling to protect. The theory being that if your government can protect you, then you don't need the protection of another government. So that's the critical difference. So it can very easily be non-state actors, including family members. It's just a matter of what's the protection or lack thereof. So really, most important takeaway for asylum and refugee is asylum is not given for fear of death. Asylum is not given because it's a war zone. Asylum is only given, and refugee status is only recognized because of fear of persecution. So people have to qualify under these call them the 5 protected grounds: race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. This definition exists the way it is because it was published in 1951, which is what happened right before 1951? World War II. So this definition was very much in response to our failure to protect people who were fleeing Nazi Germany during World War II. We denied entry to Jews who were fleeing the Holocaust. We sent people back to occupied territory who then ended up dying in the Holocaust. It's a very embarrassing reality for the international community. And we said, like we've said way too many times, never again. Wrote up this definition and said, we're going to protect people under these grounds. What's missing from this? Race, religion, nationality, political opinion, membership in a particular social group. When we talk about diversity, what else do we usually talk about? Gender?
Yeah,
Is that what you're going to say?
and also this instance of like abuse and that sort of thing. It doesn't really accommodate for anything relating to that.
Mm-hmm, exactly.
Domesticated violence.
Yeah, domestic violence and abuse, and that could maybe fall under gender, but the problem with gender is there's been these definitions. Membership in a particular social group has been developed over time, but gender isn't particular enough because 51% of the population is women. So you can't say that that's a very well-defined particular social group. It would have to actually exist in the definition to be protected. Things like gender, sexual orientation are a little bit better protected in a particular social group. So LGBTQ community could develop there, could fit into that category. But this is something that's in constant development. So it's one thing to have the text of this. This was agreed to. It was an international convention signed in 1951. The US put it into our law in 1980. We just copied and pasted that text. So this is a text that's also in our domestic law. But since that point, it's then been interpreted in immigration courts. And we're going to talk about the role of that interpretation when I talk about immigration courts. But this is a definition to know and to understand that it's not fear of death, it's fear of persecution. And several of you brought up the fact that somebody needs to be outside of the country, or what would it be, what's the difference between an asylum seeker and a refugee? So if somebody's fleeing violence, but they're still in their country, they're considered an internally displaced person, or IDP, which is a part of migration we almost never talk about, but it's actually one of the largest populations in the world, are people who are internally displaced because of violence. The other two categories is asylum seeker in the US versus a refugee. So some of you, Buffalo's a big refugee resettlement community. I've heard a couple of you reference your experience with refugee resettlement. Somebody who enters the US as a refugee typically has sought asylum in another country. So it might be somebody who fled from Syria, they sought asylum or they sought safety in Turkey, and that's where they did all the paperwork. So that's where they actually went under the process of qualifying for that definition. And it's only after they were recognized under the definition that then they get on an airplane and fly to Buffalo and make their life here. So they're already a recognized refugee at the moment of boarding the plane. The US resettles less than 1% of the world's recognized refugees, and even lower now. I think we're probably down to 0.5%. But the point is that somebody who enters the US as a resettled refugee has already qualified well in another country, and is then we're the third country that they're coming to. Versus an asylum seeker, so the same person from Syria could have flown theoretically to Mexico. This doesn't happen actually very commonly from Syria, but from another country, from Congo, can fly to Mexico, come up and cross the US-Mexico border, and then be in the paperwork process, the process of qualifying under that definition, while they're still in the United States. That's the community, for example, that you heard a lot of news about this summer, that was arriving to Buffalo, New York, that were the Congolese community. Those were mostly asylum seekers. So they hadn't yet qualified under the definition. They're in the middle of an immigration courts process to see, do I qualify or not? So that's when you use the words that technically after somebody's already qualified, once they're recognized, so they're an asylum seeker while they're waiting for recognition. Once they're recognized, they can also be called a refugee. But usually then we're just call them immigrants and they get legal permanent residency. So we don't usually enter into those technicalities as much. But that's an important distinction to know. It depends on where you're doing your paperwork and then where you're flying to afterwards, the difference between asylum and refugee. So in the midst of all of this landscape, it's important to know who is actually in charge of the different areas of immigration. So there's one major agency within the US government that manages most immigration-related matters. It's called the Department of Homeland Security. As you know, that wasn't created until after 2001, after 9/11. It was an effort to consolidate a lot of intelligence and defend against terrorists. And that's when a lot of the immigration-related pieces went into the Department of Homeland Security. So you have several pieces. You've got Customs and Border Protection. You can see we've got what we call the blue shirts, Office of Field Operations, who are at the ports of entry. And then the green shirts, who are Border Patrol, and they patrol between the ports of entry. How many of you have gone to Canada from here? Almost everyone. I haven't gone to Canada from here yet. So when you come back to the country, usually you're encountering a blue shirt, an Office of Field Operations person. Their main task is to facilitate legitimate trade and travel. So their main job is to check your visa and passport as you come through, inspect all the fruits and vegetables coming in through Nogales, and then also if they're looking for drugs or other illicit activity. They also process asylum seekers when asylum seekers arrive at the port of entry. Border Patrol is mostly patrolling between ports of entry, so they're not very focused on legitimate trade and travel. They're focused on folks who are crossing the border between ports of entry or goods that are crossing between ports of entry. If you see, this doesn't show up very well on the slide, but if you've seen the pictures in the news of holding cells or heard about kids in cages, usually when people are talking about that, they're referring to Border Patrol holding cells. We actually refer to those as detention centers. Border Patrol calls them holding cells, because if you think about them as a detention center, there's certain rights that somebody would have. They have a right to a bed, they have a right to a shower. Border Patrol calls them holding cells because then that way they don't have to give people access to a bed and access to a shower. So it's a definitional difference that makes a big difference in people's experience of the place. So that's all Customs and Border Protection. Immigration and Customs Enforcement does immigration enforcement within the United States. So they're people who in New York City might stop somebody and arrest them and put them into deportation proceedings. And they also run all of the long-term detention facilities in the US. Sometimes not directly, sometimes they contract, 65% of the time they contract with a private company, but they're technically in charge of long-term detention while people are waiting for their immigration court hearings. So Batavia Detention Center is run by Immigration and Customs Enforcement. This center that I pointed out earlier is partially run by Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And then, deeply ironically, this is also unique in the United States, within the very same department that does immigration enforcement, we also have the part that gives people legal status. So U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services is within the Department of Homeland Security. And their role is supposed to be to grant people evaluate and grant people for visas, for legal permanent residency, for citizenship. And it's not supposed to be primarily an enforcement agency, but in its current time, it's turning into an enforcement agency, where many people will go in, maybe they're married, and they're trying to get visa and legal status through their marriage, and then USCIS will turn them over to Immigration and Customs Enforcement to go into deportation proceedings. So that's one of the ways that those things work together. And then the final thing to be aware of is the Department of Justice is also involved in immigration-related adjudication. Who knows the three branches of government? High school civics, yeah.
Executive, judicial, legislative.
Executive, judicial, legislative. Immigration court, not in the judicial branch. Immigration court is in the executive branch. So immigration court is under the Department of Justice. It's considered an administrative court. It doesn't have any independence from the executive. So remember how I said this definition is important and how it's interpreted matters? The final interpreter of this, the Supreme Court of Immigration Court, is Attorney General Barr. So he gets to decide, ultimately, does somebody qualify under this definition? So your group, for example, had a woman who was a survivor of domestic violence. Under the previous administration, that person did qualify for asylum or for refugee recognition. Attorney General Sessions overturned that decision and said, I don't think they qualify anymore. It used to be that you could qualify on family connections. So if your family was being targeted, that's something about you that's very particular with your last name or your family connection. Attorney General Barr recently said, that's not particular enough, it doesn't qualify for the definition. So there's not a process through the Supreme Court that these decisions are made about the law. It's all made through the Department of Justice. The final point to make when we think about agencies is it hasn't always been this way. So I mentioned that post 9/11 is when a lot of this was restructured. It used to be that many pieces of immigration were under the Department of Justice. Border Patrol was actually under the Department of Labor before. And what is now ICE, what was Immigration and Naturalization Services, was under the Department of Justice. Again, back to how words matter, agency placement also matters. When we see immigration as a matter of justice and a matter of labor versus seeing immigration as a matter of homeland security, it makes a big difference for the policies that we choose to enact and our attitude towards immigrants. So what branch of government are we still missing? Well, we missed the judicial altogether. We've got the executive, and then we have Congress. Congress theoretically has a funding and oversight role in this. They can decide how much money does Border Patrol get to run their detention, how much money does Immigration and Customs Enforcement get to run their detention centers, which these funding debates are coming up, so I encourage you to follow that funding piece. Congress theoretically is the part of our government that passes laws. Hasn't passed very many recently, certainly not when it comes to immigration. So when you think about immigration, there's 4 main laws, legal precedents, there we go, that shape our modern immigration system. 1924 was a very intentionally racist immigration law. So they set certain quotas, essentially based on how white somebody was and what country they came from. So Eastern Europeans at the time weren't actually considered white, so they were also excluded under the quota system. Asian migration was largely stopped in 1924 under this quota system. And then in 1965, that eliminated those race-based quotas and put up what is now our modern immigration system. Which if you want to learn more about that, we have a simulation at 4 p.m. of the legal immigration system. And that's going to be a lot less of me talking and a lot more of you all interacting. But people talk about we need comprehensive immigration reform, or our immigration system is broken, or what have you. Hear those phrases a lot. Last time we ever really redid our legal immigration system was in 1965. So it's been 54 years since we've revamped how we let people into this country. So we don't like to use the word that our system is broken because it can be disempowering, like how are you going to put together a shattered glass? What we say is our system is outdated. 54 years ago, we didn't have smartphones, we barely had computers, we didn't have the internet. The reality of our world was very different. So we need to update our system for our new reality. Next important immigration act, which people call a comprehensive act, but I would dispute how comprehensive that is 1986. That's when people were given legal authorization, so it was a pathway to legalization and citizenship for folks who are unauthorized. But it also started our workplace enforcement. So I know Buffalo, it was about a year ago or 2 years ago that there were raids on workplaces of, I think, was it Mexican restaurants? It was 3 years ago. Oh, wow, time flies. Those kinds of workplace enforcement started in 1986. And then the final 23 years ago is the last time we've substantially redone anything in our immigration system. And the process leading up to that is the 1986 law was passed, and policies makers realized this wasn't truly comprehensive. We didn't actually go through what we needed to in the system. And so they started this bipartisan commission, said, we're going to really study this issue, we're going to come up with suggestions, and we're going to do another reform. Put together the bipartisan commission came up with a series of recommendations. Congress only took the enforcement part of that, and then they added some other enforcement measures, and they added the 1996 Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act. Most of the enforcement mechanism that we have now was set up in 1996. It took a lot of power away from immigration judges who could have decided not to deport somebody in the past. They could have had a mom who'd lived in the US for 15 years, who didn't have documents, and they could have said, we won't deport you, we'll give you legal status. That used to be the discretion of immigration judges. They no longer have a lot of that power. It set up this mandatory detention system that now has expanded to detain 51,000 people. And they made it easier to take away legal status for somebody who already had qualified for a visa or legal permanent residency. Legal status is now compared to being permanently on probation. So one slip and you can lose that legal status because of the 1996 law. So this is the history that we're facing. And important to be aware of that as we throw around terms like comprehensive immigration reform, we need to think about how are we actually going to change how people get into the country? What does this mean for folks who are in the country? and what does it mean for enforcement? But the path that we've undertaken in the last 54 years isn't one that's kept up with our modern realities. So as you can think about other developments in the system, I don't have enough time to go over this. Oh yeah, very early. So that's the legal tradition. A few things to be aware of are some of the common concerns or the common myths when it comes to immigration. This is the last part that I'll talk about, because again, my job is to equip you all so that you can go out and read articles better, and not teach you everything you ever need to know about our immigration system. You hear a lot about the economic impact of immigration. So there's concern about are immigrants taking away jobs? Is it detrimental to our economy? In Buffalo specifically, actually, I've learned how beneficial immigration is to the Buffalo economy because of the decline in population and the decline in traditional industries. And the fact that so many of the immigrants who moved to Buffalo are small business people have gotten the neighborhoods revitalized. It also shows, the data shows in general, that immigrants do contribute to GDP. This is the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine did a meta-analysis of immigration studies. So they essentially took all of the research that's been done on the economic impact of immigration and said, what are the large trends and conclusions we can draw? One of the large conclusions is immigration has contributed in 2015 and 2016, $2 trillion to our GDP. It has been significant for the growth of the US economy. And it's had little to no negative wage effects or effects on the overall employment levels of people who are native born. So this isn't a definitive, the second finding isn't saying, well, when immigrants arrive, everybody's wages go up. But it's also not saying when immigrants arrive, people's wages go down. What it finds is that immigrants are not direct substitutes for native workers. They're not taking exactly the same job. An immigrant might be working in the kitchen in Burger King, whereas somebody else is in the cashier position in the front of the house because they speak English. So because of the different jobs that immigrants take, in the medium term, there isn't a negative wage effect. Fiscal impact of immigration, in other words, what's the impact on the federal budget? Immigrants do contribute taxes. So state and local taxes obviously are paid because of sales tax. That's anybody who makes a purchase has to pay sales tax. But they're also usually over 50% of the time paying into the federal tax system. And that's why undocumented immigrants have contributed to barely keeping alive the Social Security Trust Fund. So I don't think many of us in the room, especially those of you who are students, have a ton of hope of receiving Social Security when we actually retire. But if we do receive Social Security when we retire, it'll probably be because of the extra money that's put in from immigrants who don't have authorization. Because they're paying into the system, but they can't actually receive Social Security whenever they retire in 30 or 40 years. When we talk about the fiscal impact, though, you have to consider both what's the money that's coming in, as well as what's the money that's being spent by the government. And here, I think many of us who work in immigration issues and who are in favor of immigrants focus a little bit too much on this and don't consider what are the expenditures. We have to be realistic that there are expenditures related to immigration. Immigrants aren't eligible for most federal benefits, with the exception of refugees. So those of you who have worked with refugees, they do qualify for several different kinds of federal benefits. Most unauthorized immigrants and most immigrants more broadly don't qualify for federal benefits. But their children do attend school. So they are in local schools, and that does have a fiscal cost to it. What we find if we run all of these numbers, and I'm not going to go into the whole detail of the fiscal impact, but it's essentially that in local governments, immigrants pose a small financial burden because of the school attendance, and the tax money that they're paying at a local level isn't making up for that. Whereas at the federal level, immigrants are providing a huge surplus because they're paying federal taxes but not receiving any federal benefits. So I don't know if any of you take economics, but that makes this more of a redistribution question. If the federal government is getting a surplus, whereas the local governments are at a small deficit, it's more a question of shouldn't the federal government be better redistributing the gains of immigration? Because, again, we have to be realistic about the cost of education, which is anybody, regardless of status, has access to K-12 education in the US. That's a Supreme Court decision. And the children of immigrants who are US citizens also have access to K-12 education. So economics, fiscal, and then the third issue that usually comes up is what's the impact of immigration on crime levels. Lots of different ways to look at this. This is the most rigorous, I would say, the one that doesn't fall into some of the fallacies that we say about immigration and crime. But essentially what this graph shows is a graph of all of these different cities in the US, that as the undocumented share of the population increases, so as there's more unauthorized immigrants in a particular city, the level of violent crime is correspondingly low. Doesn't mean that there's causation, so it doesn't mean that the arrival of unauthorized immigrants causes the rate of violent crime to go down, but it does mean that there's a correlation between the two. And there's certainly no evidence that communities with more immigrants have higher levels of violence or higher levels of crime. So the best data that we have says that it's lower. Maybe in some communities it could be the same, but there's no evidence that immigration is linked to higher crime rates. Those are some of the three key myths, just so that you understand the data. And I put in my sources because I think it's important for you to verify my sources and make sure that the data is accurate, the methodology is accurate. And I encourage you to dive in a little bit more into the numbers as well. If my clicker works, there we go. A few other sources to look at when you're fact-checking your own understanding or when you're in conversations about immigration. Pew Hispanic does a lot of data on just the undocumented individuals or unauthorized immigrants or immigrants more broadly. Where are they living? What jobs do they work in? So the demographic profile of immigration in the US. Syracuse Track is a tool that tracks immigration courts. So you can see different approval rates, where are asylum seekers coming from, what other immigration issues are being dealt with in the courts. I spend most of my time on the Syracuse Track website because I'll look up individual immigration judges, I'll look up data from particular years. It's a really, really useful tool if you're a data nerd like myself. And then the third is the Migration Policy Institute. That's a DC think tank that does a variety of research about migration and isn't US specific. So they also look into migration in Europe. And again, if we're going to talk about mobilities, we have to talk about the movement in many different ways and not just focus on a Central America US corridor. So hopefully that's some information that will arm you well for your critical thinking about immigration. And I think we have a few minutes for if you have any questions about what I covered or if there's an issue I didn't cover that you want to know about.
It isn't really a question, but the 1924 Immigration Act, I think it would be helpful for people to understand it. It wasn't just for Asians. In fact, it was particularly for Italians, Greeks, and Jews. And that was the whole policy that kept Jews out of here during the Holocaust. I mean, so it was it set the stage for our immigration policy for most of the 20th century.
Exactly, yeah, it's important. I appreciate you bringing up again. It was defining as who was considered white, which in that case,
Yeah.
Italians and Jews weren't considered white. And that's, oh well, my clicker's not gonna work. That's 40 years that it's impacted who's lived here. And we haven't really recovered in a sense that we haven't had adequate immigration policies to address the previous injustice.
And that was driven by eugenics to a great extent.
This is ironically, just to point out the timing of it, it's around the same time that illegal entry was made a crime in the US. So it was a similar policy of white nationalism and eugenics that led to both of those legal developments.
It also covered people who were married to a person, even if they had been naturalized themselves. It didn't matter where they had come from. If they were a naturalized citizen, they lost their citizenship as well as the person who may have been Jewish or Italian or Asian in the 1924 Act. So
Yeah.
So my question is, there's always people that say, I don't mind immigrants as long as they come here illegally, or they come here legally, sorry.
Yeah, that's
What have you found is the best way to combat that statement?
Well, what I usually say is that most of the immigrants that I've met in Nogales, Mexico, also want to be able to enter the country legally. So it's important for us to have a functioning legal system. And the Catholic Church as well teaches about that. The law matters a lot. And that's why we need to have a law that functions, so we need to have a law that's not 54 years old. And why we need to understand that sometimes people can't exist in the current legal framework. So I would agree with this deeper longing of having a functioning legal system. In the absence of that, then we also need to understand the reasons that people are moving. But I think it's a legitimate concern.
I have a question about the Act in 1996 and like how it relates to now, because they haven't changed anything since. It says it makes it easier to remove people with regards to their statuses and stuff like that. And I was just wondering, is there a reason as to why they want to make it easier to remove instead of accept, or is it just because they want to make a policy that is more, I don't want to say efficient because you don't want to just remove people that don't have that have legal status, but like, is it possible that like with the influx of immigrants in the last couple decades, like they just wanted to make a policy that was more efficient, could handle more cases faster? Is that why they made it easier to remove people, or was it like strictly biased against those people?
So it's actually a little bit of both. The second part that you said isn't related to that specific statute. It's related, this was 1996, I couldn't put all of the effects of 1996. 1996 also implemented expedited removal, which is that they saw more people arriving, we're gonna make it easier to remove them without seeing an immigration judge. So that was that component of it. This one of removing people with legal immigration status was more tied to the 1990s movement of being tough on crime. So it's more tied to the criminal justice side of, and we saw a variety of policies at a federal and state level on that front. But for example, that means that we received somebody who was a legal permanent resident who lived 25 years in Nogales, Arizona, and shoplifted at the local food city, and then that was enough to get him deported to Nogales, Mexico. So that was more from the tough on crime piece, because it still takes the same amount of time to remove somebody's legal status. It's not the expedited removal piece, but the expedited removal actually is another part of the 1996 law that continues to be expanded today. So it started in 1996 and it was expanded in 2003, that component of it.
Joanna, can you just describe a little bit of what the Keno Borders project is now doing to respond to some of the more recent actions by our president? I know you're in the middle of building a new building that's going to kind of house a lot of the people that can no longer get out of Mexico because they're awaiting their immigration status. So can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I didn't go into a lot of depth about KBI. If you want to learn more, actually, you can come tomorrow evening at 6 p.m., right?
Yes.
So, okay. But in general, we provide humanitarian aid in Nogales, Mexico, and we also do education and advocacy. So the space that Maureen is referring to is that we're going to expand our shelter space. So right now we have an aid center that's the size of half of this room, where we serve about 150 people a day meals. Actually, this Friday that I was there, we served 290 breakfasts, which was a little overwhelming in that small of a space. But we're going to expand our space. We're going to have more shelter space. We're also expanding our programs to provide integration opportunities in Nogales, Mexico. So we're going to do job training so that people can get computer skills or English skills that will allow them to work for some of the companies that are based in Nogales, Mexico, to try to address the reasons for migration. And we are continuing to expand our legal services. So as the asylum definition is so complicated, and we've talked about the importance of that interpretation, we're continuing to expand our ability to represent people in immigration court so that they can navigate that and, if possible, win their immigration cases. We've won several cases this year. We've also lost several cases recently of people who are fleeing violence but couldn't qualify under that protected ground. So that's a little bit what we're doing right now to respond to the realities in Nogales, Mexico. And I forgot to do this earlier, sorry, Caitlin. If you want to learn more about Keno Border Initiative, you can come on an immersion. Immersion application deadlines are this Friday. So you can come down to the El Salvador and US-Mexico border immersion, and then to really become pros on all of this. But more importantly, you'll get the chance to hear from some of the people that were represented on these little pieces of paper. Those are real individuals who have come through our aid center. So you'll have a chance to meet them, hear their stories, understand what the journey has looked like for them.
Can you tell us what happened to the people in these stories?
Most of them are still in limbo. So the transgender individual actually is in her asylum hearing process right now. It's not going particularly well. The Nicaraguan individual did win his case. The Silvia, was that who you had, ended up losing her case. The family from Guerrero hasn't had their final hearing yet. And Carla kind of lost, is in appeal. Yeah, she lost and is now appealing the decision. Well, thanks so much for being here, for your attention. Happy to, if you follow up with me, I'm sure somebody can give you my contact information if you have other questions as you're trying to digest these data and policies. More than happy to be a resource in addition to all the websites that I just shared.
There are also in the back applications and more information for the Keno and El Salvador trip with campus minister and Dr. Clayton, who's right here. We have another event at 4 and then another one at 6. Okay, very busy day. And you were given hopefully an evaluation or assessment sheet. We would really appreciate your help in filling that out for us, and we'll get that to someone in the back to help us continue to improve our programming here. Thank you all.